first topic today is transforming nations and cities. Now, this panel will explore how cities and nations can transform themselves through technology and what more can be done to use technology to benefit lives through collaborations between the public, private, and people sectors. Now, but before we proceed, a quick reminder, again, you can engage in conversation with the panelists as well, and that is using Pigeonhole. So once again, we're going to pull up that slide for you, Pigeonhole at AT. So you can enter the password at SNIWEEKOS, that is SNIWEEKOS. So please use that platform if you have any questions or comments that you have for our panelists. Again, remember you can join in the conversation as well at Twitter, and the hashtag is SmartNation. Follow us as well at Facebook and Twitter. So first, let me welcome our moderator for this morning. He is Dr. Parag Khanna, a Senior Research Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And Dr. Parag will be driving the discussions for both panels. So, Dr. Parag, if you could join me on stage. So let's welcome our panelists on stage today. Ms. Harriet Green, Chairman and CEO, IBM Asia Pacific. Mr. Murat, Sonmez, Managing Director and Head of Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Global Network, World Economic Forum. And last but not least, Senior Minister of State, Dr. Janil Puthucheary.
Thank you so much, Glenda. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, ministers, delighted to join you this morning. And as I'm sure you all agree, it's been already a very inspiring set of presentations, very rich conversation. We're going to deepen that now over the next two panels that we're going to have together. Now, so often when we talk about smart nation, the conversation breaks down into smart government, smart business, smart economy, smart society. But as we well know here in Singapore, and as the discourse is also coming to realize, it's all of those things at the same time. And I want to highlight to that end, for those who missed the presentation, the speech yesterday evening by Minister Vivian, he spoke very, very eloquently about a couple of the objectives that fit under Smart Nation that I wanted to highlight. He spoke about having the best digital infrastructure, 5G, fiber optic internet, sensor networks that promote everything from digital banking, secure mobile payments, everything that contributes to lowering transaction costs and increasing trust. And he also spoke about an innovation ecosystem that is focused on smart money. And to that end, he reminded us about the Global Innovation Alliance amongst domestic and international companies that Singapore is participating in. And we heard from TPM Teo this morning about all of the many applications of technology that contribute to the smart society angle as well. Of course, things that the government is doing and bringing business in to achieve the technologies for fitness and national health care, sensor networks that lead to energy savings in our utilities, efficient and safe transit and traffic, and secure interpersonal transactions and transactions with the government, such as SingPass Mobile. So there is a lot going on right here in Singapore. There is a lot that fits under the rubric of Smart Nation, both for Singapore and all other countries to pursue as well. So to deepen on those themes, we have an absolutely fantastic panel to kick things off. Immediately to my left is Ms. Harriet Green. Harriet is CEO and Chairman of IBM Business in the Asia Pacific. Prior to joining IBM, she served as CEO of the travel firm Thomas Cook Group. And in 2016, she was inducted into the Women in Technology Hall of Fame. Congratulations on that. To her left is Murat Sonmez. He is the head of the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, which I visited last week. Open invitation to everyone to go and visit the forum's office. It's a beautiful facility, growing very quickly, and it aims to accelerate cross-sector cooperation for Fourth Industrial Revolution governance. And it's notable how many Asian countries are involved with the center already. And previously, he was the managing director and chief business officer of the World Economic Forum. And last but certainly not least, someone who we have to thank in many ways for driving so much of what we're experiencing here this week and the Smart Nation initiative in general is Dr. Janil Puthucheary, who is currently the Senior Minister of State, Minister in the Ministry of Communications and Information, and the Minister of Transport in the Government of Singapore. He's the Minister in charge of the Government Technology Agency, GovTech. So what we're going to do in this conversation, in this panel, is to have each of the panelists give about 3 to 4 minutes of opening comments. And then we're going to have a free-flowing discussion. Get your Pigeonhole apps ready. We'll be taking comments and questions as we proceed through the discussion. And we'll probably run out of time before we want to. So let me, without further ado, kick it over to you, Harriet, to lead us in this discussion about what are your organizations, companies doing to contribute to Smart Nation?
Well, thank you. And we have just a few small minutes, I think, to add to some of the themes laid down in the opening. And I would like to start by talking about where enterprises are in the whole area of smarter nations and smarter cities. As we spend time with small startups, medium-sized companies, and pillars of every major industry, at the CEO level, at the working level, at the developer level, there are 4 major themes that appear to be converging around this huge new wave of technology. The first is, of course, the expertise of that company, which may be a little different to what they actually make. The second is the data that they create, the data that they want, the data that they need. 80% of the world's data is not searchable. It belongs to the companies that support the nations, the planets, the businesses, activities. This is sales data, roaming data, transactional data. And what companies are looking to do with that data to develop capabilities that we are discussing here today, I hope we get examples to talk about. Thirdly, the platform. You know, what platforms they use. Are they a platform? Their own IT systems, as they think about this new generation of cloud and AI, is really, really important. But perhaps the theme that unites companies and enterprises across all of the countries is the issue of change. This exponential shift in technology, but how do businesses operationalize that and change? And then I think the final point that I hope we get to talk about, all this great talk about tech and technology, which is phenomenal. But with this greater power goes a responsibility, a deep responsibility around stewarding and being the guardians of the data of our clients and of the people that give us that data. Whether we are governments, whether we are businesses, this whole issue of data stewardship is at the very center of data and digitization. So I hope that we'll get to talk about that.
Certainly will. That raises some very interesting questions that we'll come back to. Let me first next pass it over to Murat.
Thank you, Parag. As the amount of innovation and information is exponentially growing and rapidly doing it, we're increasingly finding ourselves in what we call the too late zone. By the time we figure things out, it's too late. It's true for governments, for universities, but particularly for governance and regulation, because the technology is adapting rapidly. There's also, with all the opportunities that artificial intelligence, gene editing, 3D printing represents for citizens, there's a danger that only the privileged few will take advantage of that. And the gap that's already been increasing between the haves and have-nots will be further widened. And that's not good morally, it's not good economically, and it's not good from a society perspective. So we felt that there was a need to co-design a new operating system for the society that is human-centric in its view, and looking at projecting a future where we can accelerate and amplify the positive benefits to citizens and society, and walk backwards and say, what are the protocols needed, technical protocols, regulatory framework, maybe legislation, and how can we as a global community put our heads together on a continuous basis? And that's what led us to create the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, and we're now expanding into other countries. Our aim is to accelerate the positive benefits and ideally eliminate, but most likely minimize the negative impact. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you look at AI, we need data. Where the data comes from is critical, because right now the algorithms derived from the data doesn't have a source code. There's no programmer, so we don't know what they are. So we're looking at authenticating the source of data across all Internet of Things. And blockchain could represent an interesting opportunity. Who owns the data, what you can do with it, and how you get rewarded? Again, blockchain, by the way, we're 100% buzzword compliant, so you'll see all these things from the center. So smart contracts and tokens, maybe we can set up a token exchange. How do we make sure that these devices or the algorithms are ethical? We have no control over the algorithms at the moment. We're looking at asking the machines to tell us what the algorithms are, but we don't have that technology. So maybe we can embed an ethics switch into these smart things so that if an unethical request comes, like a car to drive into the crowd or a transformer to blow up or a medical device to kill the host, the thing will say, no, I'm not going to do it. So those are some of the opportunities and challenges we have. And finally, I'd like to talk about 3D printing. It's a revolutionary technology. It will be the new distribution channel. We'll be able to 3D print pretty much every product. So then it has huge implications on commerce and cross-border data flows. But one example that I saw recently was with ETH Zurich. It's a technical university, very prestigious in Switzerland. It's known as MIT of Europe. If you ask Lino Gzela, the president, he says MIT is the ETH of United States. They are working on a 3D printed human silicon heart. So they'll take your measure and you'll have a 3D printed heart. Right now it beats for 2 hours and you're dead because the battery doesn't last long. And it doesn't handle the pressure. But over time it will. And as you may know, cardiovascular diseases is the #1 killer, if I'm not mistaken, including the wars. So if you have a 3D printed human heart, you will not have cardiovascular diseases. It is true. I mean, the question is who gets the benefit from it? And finally, what happens to the cardiologists? So I'll stop here and then.
On that, we'll certainly come back to that. Let's get SMS Janil, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming here. As a small, resource-constrained city-state, we can't afford to be in the too late zone. We can't afford to be the cardiologist when everybody has a 3D printed heart solving cardiovascular disease. So we see the Smart Nation effort as an opportunity to significantly transform our entire country, our economy, our society, our structure. This is not something entirely new. We began on our national computerization program 30 years ago. So much of the infrastructure that we enjoy today that's enabling what's happening around us was put in place decades ago. I thought I might string together the various pieces that you mentioned at the beginning, Parag, about the digital economy, the digital readiness, and digital government, and give you a sense of how it ties together for our Smart Nation vision, and how it becomes that vehicle for transformation. This particular wave, I said we started 30 years ago, but this particular wave started maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we started with our cybersecurity agency. We began with security as the first part of our strategy for this wave. And then our Personal Data Protection Commission. So looking at issues of confidence, of privacy, of protection. We have enacted our Cybersecurity Act. That's come into force, our Personal Data Protection Act. We've then reorganized government and brought together talent in the Prime Minister's office under the Smart Nation Digital Government Group, Government Technology Agency to put engineering at the heart of government. We have reorganized the Infocom Media Development Authority, and we've now got this year the Public Sector Governance Act, looking at how public sector data protection is managed and maintained and operated. And then now we're moving into the phase of launching our digital economy framework, a digital readiness blueprint, which has already been launched actually last weekend. And then today you've just heard DPM Puthucheary talk about a digital government blueprint. And then at the end of this year, we're going to start reviewing our Personal Data Protection Act all over again and start the cycle all over again. What this ties together is that scale of ambition to completely transform our country, our economy, our society. So think really big, but start small and act fast, and do it on an iterative basis. We've got to think about it in terms of processes, in terms of product, and in terms of talent. And each of these things that we do has to have a process element, a product element, and a talent element. And then break it down a little bit further. We've got our 5 national strategic projects. And each of them has key components of serving our whole economy, being an opportunity to build within government engineering talent we didn't already have, and an opportunity to reconsider a legislative and a regulatory framework that we hadn't previously tackled. We've heard some of that in the speech from Deputy Prime Minister. We've got our national digital identity, our e-payments framework, smart urban mobility, our moments of life, and our national sensor platform. We've launched all of these. We're getting the engineering talent together. We're getting our centers of excellence together. We're starting to review the regulation and legislative postures around those issues. And now we've got to move to the next tier, and that's built into our digital government blueprint. The next 30 to 50 products, platforms, and services. Not quite whole of nation, maybe 2 or 3 ministries, 2 or 3 challenges. How do they come together? And again, each of them have a few defining characteristics. There's a physical, tangible product, an opportunity for optimizing or re-engineering process and policy, and a real-world outcome in terms of improving the quality of life or efficiency or productivity, whatever it is you want to define. So that's how it all strings together. That's the big picture, but we've got to break it down to individual products and individual key deliverables, all of which interface on any number of levels. Think big, start small, act fast.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all 3 of you for those opening comments. And I want to actually kick off a discussion now for some minutes before we bring in the audience and the pigeonhole questions. And let me start immediately with you, SMS Janil, because you are very much the guardians of the data, the way in which actually, the sense in which you mentored Harriet guardians of data, because so much data is being collected and now we need to structure how it's analyzed, used, and deployed. But I also think of it very much, quite frankly, in how Plato meant it, because the role of the guardians, as he defined the role of the government in being stewards of knowledge and using it in a way that is, of course, very much directed towards enhancing public interest and welfare. So the first question really is then, what are the biggest challenges you're facing in the implementation? Because if we think about the next 3 to 5 years, there's a clear timeline. You have the roadmaps for the government for transformation in terms of promoting entrepreneurship, like you said, centers of excellence in education, and so on. What do you anticipate to be the biggest challenges in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think there are 2 big buckets of challenges. One is social acceptance and how our community and our citizenry view what we're doing. And the other is getting the regulatory interventions and the structures correct. In the absence of prior experience, in the absence of a model of success that's out there, when we're at the frontier of what may or may not be correct. And so a decision around legislation, a decision around regulation may actually then have a very significant downside. So in this latter space, getting that structure correct, we have taken the approach of a regulatory sandbox. This has become the buzzword du jour, that we want to put it on every piece of paper, that we are going for a regulatory sandbox. Our Monetary Authority of Singapore did this very successfully around fintech, and you can see we've moved very quickly towards being having a big bench of talent, a breadth of companies innovating around different aspects of fintech, and we want to take that approach across a number of domains where there is so much uncertainty about what the right regulatory structure is to drive innovation and opportunity, to step back, put up some boundaries, make it very clear to businesses as well as the policy side of the house that you can experiment, you should feel free to do so, provided we have clear oversight, and what you do within the regulatory sandbox will inform our regulation and our legislation thereafter. So start from the premise that we really don't know what is the correct legislation or what is the correct regulation. And you need some activity and some experimentation in order to inform that. But that is a hard sell to our population, to our citizenry, to the social side, where there is fear about job loss, there's fears around data privacy, and there's an anxiety about how much value this is to them. And we have here in Singapore a significant proportion of our population that were not educated in English, and much of the services that are available online in this digital space are delivered in English. We have the majority of our population are not what you would call digital natives. They didn't grow up with the internet. This is the experiment that Caesar just did. And so persuading them that this pace of change, that we as a nation trying to be not too late but ahead of the curve, that we as a government trying to experiment and be bold with risk-taking is of benefit to them. And sketching out that bold vision of benefit to the population. These are the two biggest challenges, I think, facing us.
Very glad you raised the issue of social acceptance. Later this week, McKinsey has its latest report coming out on smart cities, and they have a ranking framework, and it involves technology adoption, sort of GDP, wealth, but also for the first time, they've done a fairly extensive survey in all of the cities that they've researched around the acceptance, if you will, of the latest technologies. And they're factoring that into the score, really, of how smart a nation is, just how informed are the public. And as we get into a situation, Harriet, where, as you say, 80% of the data that's been harvested hasn't been fully mined and in a way monetized, that's going to raise a lot of questions, because companies like IBM and others are going to be finding ways to use that data for ways that are obviously going to generate corporate benefit, but also stimulate the ecosystem. And that, of course, is going to have regulatory consequences. So could you weigh on this issue in terms of how usage of data, your plans for it, what you're seeing other companies doing, then winds up feeding into the regulatory conversation? How close is your relationship with governments, and how strong is that dialogue?
Yeah, as I raised in the opening, I think we feel that for businesses, societies, governments, this is a very central theme. Not just how the data is used, and my point was that 80% of the world's data belongs to enterprises and to companies and is not searchable. The other kind of major theme, and then I will share directly the answer to the question you asked, is around this issue of transferring unconscious, or indeed conscious bias, that many humans have into the coding and the development of the artificial intelligence and other new capabilities. And so ensuring that we have diversity and rich inclusion so that those that develop, program, code don't all look like, behave like, or come from one gender is very important. At IBM, we feel so strongly about this because for over 50 years of working with clients' data, from original transaction processing to the microprocessor to now, we've always had two simple kind of mantras. The first is the data belongs to our clients. It is not for us to take it, mine it, extrapolate it, sell it in a large knowledge graph. It is our clients' data. And we only extract the insights with the explicit knowledge of the client so that it doesn't end up in the hands of competitors and can be appropriately anonymized. So we are very concerned both at the individual level, particularly here in Southeast Asia. Do individuals understand the implications of yielding up their data? For enterprises and how that data is managed and provides the greatest value and insight, and then how governments work with partners in the development of smarter cities that have this core respect and this core ability to self-regulate. Obviously, I'm European. Well, actually, I'm British, so I'm not sure if I'm European anymore, but let's assume for the purposes of this.
You have a special relationship with everyone.
Well, let's hope so. But at least, the government has become very involved in issues involving enterprise data and personal data. And in North America, the emphasis has been on self-regulation. It will be interesting to see in Southeast Asia how that also develops with this huge emphasis on Smarter Planet.
This is a great point. And Murat, of course, the World Economic Forum is working with governments and trying to figure out what a new transnational regulatory framework would look like in all of these areas. And of course, there's a lot of divergence. We're seeing this with data privacy obviously playing out right now. So I would love your views on this, because there's the ethical issue, the issue of bias in AI. And again, you're dealing with governments with vastly different capacities to regulate these areas and vastly different opinions, quite frankly, on where it should go. Can there really be some kind of a common international framework on some of these issues?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
So let me explain how. So I think when we look at governance, we shouldn't think about government only. So we talk about smart government here, of course, but smart governance is also possible through different levers. I'll give you an example. For example, we're working in the IoT safety protocol. Going back to what Harriet said about debiasing data and collecting vast amounts of data. The data will come from Internet of Things. There are 7.8 billion people, but there are going to be hundreds of billions of things. So the data from the things is going to be important. So authenticating the source is critical, making sure that the thing is the thing it claims itself to be. And this has to be universally adopted across all industries, not just vertical. It has to be built on a platform that is not under any government's control, because nobody will want the others to control it. And it has to be highly secure. This is where blockchain potentially comes in, and there's a lot of interest in that. When it comes to data ownership, we're looking at different views. You have GDPR, which has been in the works for 4 years, solving a 9-year-old problem. And right in the middle of GDPR, DeepMind beat the Go player. So they hadn't factored that into their decision making. So we have an approach where we potentially decouple who owns the data, what you can do with it, and who gets rewarded. Again, new architectures like blockchain with smart contracts and tokens enable that. And that allows the governments to create their own schemes. And then we can have a look at interoperability, because going back to what you said, Harriet, about having vast amounts of data, if you look at improving agriculture yields by data collected from Singapore, it's not going to be enough. So we need to combine different data sets from different jurisdictions, and all governments are interested in improving the agriculture yield. So maybe they will be willing to share agriculture data, environment data, healthcare data, strip it out of privacy, not so much finance data. So this layered architecture is getting a lot of traction, and our approach is to do rapid prototyping. You talked about sandboxing. We're now working with 10 governments already out of San Francisco. We're opening 3 centers, and our goal is to get these prototypes implemented, take a step back and share it with the rest of the world. And we're working with China, Singapore, and pretty much every country, nation in the world, and there's one thing that they agree on, which is they want to make sure that all of this has a positive impact on their citizens and society. And the second question is what happens to jobs and skills? And the third one is, as we live longer because of all of these, with artificial hearts and gene editing and less accidents due to autonomous vehicles, we'll live to go beyond 100, 120. So what do we do after we retire at 60 is an important question, and who pays for that? So these are all common questions, and we have so far seen a very keen interest from all governments to co-design this new operating system.
So in thematic areas, there's clear a sense that that sharing, in a way, benefits everyone, without a doubt. So one area where certainly, not just rhetorically, but we're seeing action as well, that you raised in the beginning, I'd like all three of you actually to comment on, and this was in Murat's opening comments, was this paradox. You raised the too late anxiety, but then the examples you gave, especially around blockchain and so forth, really spoke to leapfrogging. Yeah. And so that raises this all-important issue, really, of technology inequality in the distribution of access and availability and people's competence to use and leverage those new technologies. So let's please have each of you comment on, and of course, without bridging that the new digital divide, you might say, you won't have the broad social acceptance that we want. So these things clearly all tie together very much. So let's just talk very, very specifically about the technology inequality, how it applies to different segments of the population, because we know that is going to be perhaps one of the key pieces of the puzzle to ensuring that everything does move forward as planned. Please, let's start with SMS, Janil.
Well, we've been grappling with this for some time. You'll be familiar with the fact that Singapore has undergone several waves of economic transformation with job disruptions and new industries coming in. So in that sense, we have some experience to layer over how we might deal with this particular wave of transformation. And we've got a number of tools and processes to use, and we're maximally utilizing them. We have a few processes. We have the Future Economy Council, and we've got these industry transformation maps looking at 23 industrial sectors. And what you see as a common thread throughout all of them is the impact of technology. the impact of the technologies on jobs, the impact of technologies on the skills development, and the structure of the market. So we're actively trying to shape that response together with the trade associations. We're fortunate that our unions, our labor movement, plays an active role in looking at reskilling, looking at job upgrading, rather than just trying to manage and maintain the status quo. Our unions and our labor movement are an active participant in how adequate training can be given to workers to transit them to new jobs. The next layer that we have is the adult training that we're providing through our Tech Skills Accelerator program, working with companies and adult learning facilities to look at how we can assist people to find that path themselves, get retraining and reskilling so that they are resilient to the future changes. And then, of course, we are re-engineering what's happening in the education space. The education space, in a way, is the part that I'm least worried about, because we've been working at that, and we have structures in place to try to make that responsive. The kids who are 10 to 16 today are growing up with the kind of digital resilience, the math skills and the cyber awareness that they will be able to navigate the space, but making sure we have those structures correct. So I think those are the layers that we need to work at. Adult re-education, a proactive labor movement that is assisting the process of transformation, and a re-engineering of the education process for that type of future resilience.
Now, Murat, please, especially because the World Economic Forum really does have global reach. In fact, you've been at the forefront of studying and quantifying these issues for a long time.
I think the technology matters, but what matters most is how you apply it. And I'll give you an example again from India. We're about to open a center there. I was with the health ministry, and they told me that in state hospitals, there's a doctor for every 12,000 citizens. And there's no way for them to build enough hospitals, train enough doctors ahead of the population curve. So we have this divergence potentially happening. So one scenario we have in mind is, what if we all swallow a nanoparticle once a week? And there's an FDA-approved nanoparticle today in the market. It collects your vitals. You can flush it out of your guts or sniff it into your bloodstream. Through a secure mobile connection, you upload your cellular data and vitals to the largest scientific knowledge base that has genetic data, clinical trials, environment data, and with machine learning assisted physicians, it prescribes a personal medicine for you. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, the effectiveness or efficacy of medicine on average is 50%. It ranges from 5 to 70%, and that's why the physicians say, try this and come back and let's see if it works for the most of the time. So with this personalized medicine, again, created with this vast data and machine learning techniques, we can download the prescription to your mobile phone, go to a certified kiosk, and have it 3D printed. These techniques exist today. It's very expensive at the moment, but we'll see the cost curve coming down as we have seen in other devices. If we can pull that off, then we can deliver the benefit to not just a few, but the rest of the society. So that's why it's really important, as you're doing here, is to have an outcome-based orientation. Not technology-driven, but technology-enabled. Not output-oriented, but again, outcome-based, and do it fast, do it in an agile manner. And we're already seeing the benefits of this approach. So more than the technology, it's the applications that it enables. And finally, the key difference in this world is, and we did that study in Japan, when you look at shared economy, and we looked at 7 or 8 ministers' laws in different ministries. If you move towards a shared economy, there are existing laws that are in conflict with each other. So we need to go from a vertical approach to a horizontal governance approach. And if we can, again, project an outcome, prove it with sandboxes and collaboration, then we can converge into that future, which is what we have seen working on a global level.
And Harriet, of course, IBM has been at the forefront of reducing the cost of some of your even very sophisticated technologies, and also very involved in education.
Indeed. So, Watson is touching, whether it's with blockchain, whether it's with quantum computing, over 1 billion people already. And we share the view that it is changing the roles and the jobs and the skills required. So we tend to be optimistic if you look at the other huge technology transformations, the transaction processing, microprocessor, the internet, but it means that we have to put a lot back. So there are 3 levels of putting back. And here in Singapore, as an example, there are the P-Tech schools that take young people who would not have a technology degree or are not in a position to even have further education and to develop schools that are pathways to technology, so they can play a role, whether it's the 100 that we have across the world. They might not even have gone on to, ninth grade. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it's around apprenticeships. We've just opened our first apprenticeship group, young people coming in to learn very specifically how to adapt in this new environment. And then perhaps most importantly, and Singapore is, I guess, in a very privileged position to need this, what about the people who are 30, 40, and 50 to retrain for this world of work, lifetime learning? And so programs that take people to help reskill and retrain so that they can play a part in these capabilities. So at each part of that learning curve, it's essential that technology companies put back, not just into technology and their own profits, but into the real societal needs that individual countries have.
And of course, the demographic question is particularly sensitive and relevant to Singapore, where you have second highest or highest really life expectancy in the world. A number of economists have started proposing that actually our calculations around how we do dependency ratios should really be modified, because if people are going to be working past the age of 70, then they're not necessarily just net recipients of welfare, but are still taxpayers and contributors. So let's turn to some of the questions that we've been getting here in Pigeonhole, and we'll start with one that is related to Smart Nation for SMS Janil, and it's about really how we can promote more bottom-up contributions to the Smart Nation exercise. What would you like to see, or what maybe are you already seeing, in terms of society-driven, entrepreneur-driven, student-driven kinds of smart solutions that to contribute to Smart Nation, that take advantage, of course, of now the broad technology base that Singapore has provided?
We're seeing quite a lot already. If you look at our institutes of higher learning, everything that's happening in our post-secondary space, the polytechnics, the universities, the various other institutions, almost all of them have opportunities for students who are either pursuing a tech-related course of study or a business-related course of study to actually get going with some form of incubation experience, some form of startup experience. So many of them are leaving formal education, having already had a taste of their first startup, and are now coming out into the working world, looking at their second, or thinking about the acceleration phase. Mm-hmm. We've had experience with BASH, now SG Innovate, and Block 71 at Ayer Rajah Crescent. That's become Block 71 and 73, 79. This was Mr. Vivian's speech yesterday. And some of that's also going overseas. So we've got these dense startup ecosystems. Mm-hmm. We've got a crowd of kids coming through with a deep sense of both the technical side as well as the talent required in order to drive this type of startup space. And really now, I think the key next step, over and above the give us more funding, please, is making sure that we have the right matching of problem statements to the types of solutions that are coming along. And making sure, again, it's not just technology going and chasing its own tail, but making sure that we really have an outcome-driven technology matching process. We're putting in some effort through IMDA and various other agencies here in Singapore to see how we can help that and curate parts of the industry that need a little bit of a help to do so. But I think the biggest part of this solution is going to come from the larger players in the industry, looking at that ecosystem of partners, vendors, clients, customers, and consumers, and looking to see how to create that thrust forward for that startup ecosystem. It's happening already, and I think we can do more to plug into what's happening in the rest of the world.
Well, Cesar's presentation had very inspiring examples of bottom-up utilization of this technology, and then, of course, the ways in which that activity that's inspired by one individual can obviously spread through a society. How about from IBM's side? What kinds of examples would you?
Yeah, and particularly in Singapore, since we launched just 10 days ago, this call for code, and getting both the issues of diversity and inclusion, so all coders don't come from exactly the same place and do exactly the same thing. But here in Singapore, the response to that diversity and inclusion and the wanting to be involved in meaningful projects like disaster relief and how they themselves can participate, not just in their own society, but in wider societies, has been so exciting to see. And that's been replicated across larger communities, bigger countries and cities. But to whoever wrote in on that, that need, that desire to participate is very, very rich here in Singapore.
It is, certainly. Now, Murat, there's actually a broader question out there that I think is very well directed to you, which is, how do you know what problems need more of a technology solution versus also then measuring whether or not technology is really contributing to better outcomes? And of course, you have access to a lot of data and cross-country studies that you've done. So are we overemphasizing technology in some areas, and how rapidly are we measuring whether or not it's working?
I think we don't know what the solutions, what kind of solutions will be provided with these technologies. And if you go back to the internet, I was involved in the early stages 20, 30 years ago. It was just a connectivity platform. Then the browser came, the web happened, and now we can do all kinds of, we can have remote surgeries through the web. And when these building blocks were being built, the technologists didn't envision that world. So it became an enabling architecture. And we see these technologies, the horizontal technologies, as an enabling platform for things that we cannot even imagine today. And that's the real power of it. But we need to make sure that the governance of this operating system is geared towards accelerating the positive and minimizing the negative. Because otherwise, the bad people will take advantage of it. They already are doing that. And if we don't put the safety switches in, and not by over-regulating, because it's too early to regulate, but doing smart governance, I think we can create this enabling platform for these new solutions that we may not even think about. The other thing that we observe is, and this goes back to DeepMind and AlphaGo, beating Lee et al. In March 2016. I took my first AI course in '87, and this was my dream to master Go. And right after these three young men, one of them is a college dropout. Mustafa left Oxford after 2 years. Right after they mastered Go, I asked one of the leading professors of AI at UC Berkeley. I said, Stu, before these young men made it happen, if I had asked you how far we were away from mastering Go, what would you have said? He said the general consensus was 10 to 20 years. So if you had asked an expert, the answer would be we're like 10 to 20 years away. So this happened 20 years ahead of schedule. So we cannot predict the future. We can do our best to shape it. And that's the approach I think we should collectively take, including society engagement, and create this operating system.
Now, the first point that you made in answering that question earlier raises or feeds directly into the question that currently has the most votes on Pigeonhole, which is around data privacy. So I think it would be great if we can deep dive on that a little bit more for each of the three of you, if you could. The question is very straightforward. How will citizens' data privacy be protected? And again, we're seeing really a global tug of war over this issue playing out right now. Europe taking a very aggressive lead. Debates in the US about whether or what aspects of GDPR will be adopted in the United States. And Asians clearly don't all share one view around this. So let's go down the line again before our time runs out, and let's get each of your views on this issue.
I don't know that there's a clear answer at this point in time. And I think the opportunities that are available through the analysis of data are likely to only increase. And what you want is to make sure that we all benefit from that process, and that there is a sense that citizens benefit from how their data are used to look at whether it's healthcare issues, or social issues. There is some fear and anxiety given what's happened recently, and that's very understandable. It's appropriate that we need to go and correct it and put in place the right type of protections. But I think we also want to give ourselves an opportunity to think about how it will develop in the future, not to constrain the business models, not to constrain the business opportunities, but make sure that ultimately citizens have recourse to either appeal, to challenge, and to secure their privacy. And I think those are the mechanisms that are very important. For us, we have separated out our regulatory space into the private sector and how companies and consumers deal with companies deal with their consumers and clients, and the public sector. We found that actually, given some of our data sharing arrangements data acquisition arrangements reach back 30, 40 years, we have put in place so many internal controls that sharing within the public sector became a problem. The expectation of citizens that different aspects of government were able to share data in order to provide what was seen as useful services was not present. And so we passed some laws, now the Public Sector Governance Act, to actually increase within government and within public sector data sharing. But interestingly, as part of that, we then tightened external controls in terms of criminalizing some acts and so forth. So that type of balance between creating opportunities by unlocking some of the barriers and reassuring the public by putting in stringent controls. I think you need to do both in lockstep as you go forward.
Absolutely. So it's an experiment that's really unfolding. And I think while the global conversation is focused elsewhere right now, the Singapore experiment is in fact very instructive. Murat, final point on that?
Yes, given the technologies, again in blockchain space, it is now possible to decouple who owns the data, what you can do with it, and who gets rewarded. And the government can say, look, you own your gene data, and I can say, I want to be able to say, anyone can use it for cancer research free of charge. But if you want to use it for medicine discovery, ask for my permission and give me money. And we're seeing this rapid protocol development in the technical space, like Oceans or Fetch.io, which Singapore is already using. We had a breakfast about that. So we think that decoupling will give us the flexibility and the ability for the government to assign the rightful owner, for the owner to choose to say when his or its or the company's data can be used, and who gets rewarded. And we also envision the creation of national token exchanges, where the companies who use these data from the owners can issue company tokens and they can be exchanged.
If data really is the biggest single resource, if it is the commodity, the oil of this generation, then I think it is inevitable that there are three levels that are on people's minds, whether we do forums with Generation Zers or meet and talk with esteemed CEOs, there seems to be three levels. The first is an individual responsibility around data. And certainly here in Asia, maybe some of the influences from Europe, people realize that their own data is valuable, needs to be treated with respect, that you understand your settings, and that you're not just contributing to a very small number of companies becoming very wealthy on the back of your data. So I think there is a personal responsibility, and in the forums that we've been holding, increasingly that issue of your job and your work around the resource is important. Secondly, and I think we've already talked about this, companies clearly stating what they do with your data in terms of their terms, their conditions, their actual actions. And that is so critical right now, because as we begin to create algorithms, data platforms, and capabilities that are powered by artificial intelligence, those algorithms, that data, and who programs them have even greater importance. And then, as I think beautifully put, governments being able to balance the need to be able, as the Deputy Prime Minister, I thought, beautifully shared, that from the minute you start to live in a country, the information that's valuable to your education, to your environment, is immediately made available. And marrying those means you need to have trusted partners, and I think a real sense of responsibility, not just profits.
Well, this field around smart cities and smart nation has evolved very rapidly in just the last 2 or 3 years, let alone the last 10. So I want to thank our panelists for really bringing us up to the state of the art across all of these issues. You've answered a lot of questions and raised some more that we're going to continue discussing today. But first, at the moment, let's please all join together in thanking our distinguished panelists for their contributions. Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists for a very thought-provoking conversation there. You know, how we hold the future. The data is in our hands. Not to be careful not to be in the too late zone, as well as, left behind nation. So, Dr. Parag, why don't you just, sum up some of the key takeaways from this discussion for us?
The term that wasn't used that really resonates in my mind is a sort of secure connectivity, right? There is such a premium on security of data given its availability and given all of the tools that the public sector is making available, and yet wanting to make sure that we have more and more opportunities to connect to each other. So how do you balance security and connectivity? And that's where the privacy questions come in. And I think the conversation was very sophisticated around that issue, around privacy. And I think it was very good that the issue of personal responsibility was also raised. Now we have governments in the regulatory space that are trying to encourage that responsibility, but also make sure that the technology sector, which is becoming so powerful, and we'll be talking about that, of course, in the next panel, has a very important role in transparency there as well. And I think one of the other important things that came out this morning was the multi-stakeholder dimension. It's a term that the World Economic Forum itself really pioneered. This conversation was so balanced across what the public sector, the private sector, civil society, universities have to do together. And I think that's what whole of society is all about. And in Singapore, clearly we're talking a lot about that. And there's optimism around the opportunities to leapfrog. And it's not just in digital technology, but biomedical and all sorts of other areas. And Smart Nation, as much as today we emphasized a bit more the digital, is certainly a lot more when we think about human needs, the demographic changes, and so forth. And then one area which I know we'll also start to get into is around standards internationally. And that's critical because, of course, Singapore is a smart nation, but a small nation. And we want to see these standards share and spread to enlarge the pie, create more opportunities, not only in the spirit of the examples that Caesar gave, but of course because economic integration is going to create a whole new playing field, if you will. So I think standards become very, very important. And lastly is about the final point that was made was about individuals being able now to monetize that data. What are they going to do with their own data, with the data that's being unlocked that can now be used by entrepreneurs? What impact is that going to have in rippling across the economy?
Right, and that bleeds very nicely into the next panel discussion, and that is economic transformation.